Right then, rests. Now, I purposely left the subject of rests until last in this lesson, not because I think they're particularly complicated or hard to understand, but because now that we know the full family of subdivisions, rests are going to be easy peasy, hopefully. You can think of rests as a way to fill up unwanted space within a bar of written music. Unlike music notes, we don't play rests, but we do count them. They're really useful when trying to write a piece of music that requires specific spacing between notes. So if you have a really complicated piece of music, a really complicated rhythm, and with notes falling in weird parts of the bar and weird parts of the beat, then we can use rests to help move those notes around and put them in the correct place. Let me explain further. As we know, all notes have a duration that take up a certain space within the bar, but each note also has its own equivalent rest, with exactly the same duration. So a whole note has a rest that looks like this, with the same duration as 4 quarter notes. The half note rest looks like this and has a duration of 2 quarter notes. The quarter note rest looks like this and has a duration of, 1 quarter note. This is the 8th note rest, the 16th note rest, and finally the 32nd note rest. Horrible looking squiggles, aren't they? Don't get freaked out by their random looking shapes though. The hardest part about rest is remembering which one represents which subdivision. With that in mind, let me give you a few helpful pointers. The whole note and half note rests are both these little black rectangles. The whole note rests hang from the line, while the half note rest sits on top of the line like this. Then we get the quarter note rest, which is the most distinguished looking in my opinion. It's also pretty tricky to draw by hand, like a number 3 with a 7 on top. Really weird little shape. Hopefully you can see that it looks kind of long and thin, just like a quarter note. Maybe that'll become more obvious later on. Quarter note rest, kind of long and thin like a quarter note. At least the other rests sort of look like the notes they represent. So the 8th note rest looks like this, with a single tail coming off to the side here, just like an 8th note has with its single tail. The 16th note rest is exactly the same but has 2 tails coming off to the side, just like the 16th note. And it's the same for 32nd note rests with 3 tails, just like 32nd notes. It's worth pointing out that unlike notes, rests cannot be joined by their tails and are always written on their own. Because triplets use the same note types as other subdivisions, they also use the same rests. So, for example, if you had a bar of 8th note triplets like this, then you could use 8th note rests to fill in the gaps where you didn't want or don't want to play any notes like this. Because the rests appear under the triplet brackets, they have the same duration as the 8th note triplets. So any rests written underneath triplets, the number 3 or the brackets, are counted and played as the triplet they represent. Staying with this example for a moment, I want to deviate from the subject of rests briefly and talk to you about my self-imposed rule when writing out notation entitled "Less ink is better." Less ink is better. I always try to use minimum notes and rests when writing music. It's not only easier to read in most cases, but it also uses less ink in writing it out, hence the name. So, beat 1 could be rewritten like this. Instead of using an 8th note and an 8th note rest, we could replace both with just a single quarter note like this. It's played and counted exactly the same as before, but the quarter note now takes up the duration of both the 8th note and the 8th note rest. Remember that the relationship between the different subdivisions always stay the same. So a quarter note is still equal to 2 8th notes, even when written as triplets. But I don't like writing this particular rhythm like this. I prefer to notate the first and third triplet note of beat 1 like this. The tails join over the rest in the middle, so there's no need to write in the triplet bracket either. I think that joining the notes of the tails has helped to make things a little easier to read. Beat 2 can't actually be written any other way. Well, you could replace the 8th note rest with 2 16th note rests like this, but what would be the point in that when we already have a single note rest that does the same job? Do you see how beat 3 could be rewritten? It's actually a bit silly writing it as a triplet because the first note falls on the downbeat of beat 3 and then nothing else is played for the rest of the beat. So why don't we just replace the whole triplet with a normal quarter note instead like this? It's the same rhythm. Beat 4 is the same as beat 3. It can't really be written any other way. So we've moved from this to this. We've used less ink and, in my humble opinion, made it slightly easier to read. Okay, let's now move on to 16th note triplets. 16th note rests written under the triplet bracket have the same duration as 16th note triplets. Just like eighth note triplets rests, we use 16th note triplet rests to fill parts of the triplet we don't want to play on. Well, just like any rest, we use a rest to fill part of the bar or part of the beat we don't want to play on. And in case you're wondering, by the way, yes, this is a nasty bar to read and play, so don't worry, you're not alone in thinking that. Even I would find this bar yucky to play. With that in mind then, let's try to make things a little easier for ourselves by rewriting the bar using less ink. So, check this out as I hope to blow your mind. All three combinations of a 16th note and rest shown here are actually the equivalent of a single eighth note. So we can replace each combination with an eighth note instead. Remember that an eighth note is still equal to two 16th notes even when written under triplets. But guess what? Beat 1 now has 3 evenly spaced notes in it, which is exactly the same as eighth note triplets. So the rhythm we had written as 16th note triplets before, using rests as well, is actually the equivalent of 3 evenly spaced eighth note triplets, like this. At this stage you might not fully understand why this is, but knowing little things like this certainly helps to build a bigger and stronger understanding of the subdivisions, as well as how they relate to each other. Going back to beat 2 in our example then, the first thing we could do is to replace the two 16th note rests with their equivalent of one single eighth note rest like this. We could also join the tails over the rest like this. That means that we don't have to write in the triplet brackets because we can clearly see where all 3 notes of the triplet start and finish. Notice that this last note is still a 16th note with 2 tails, even if the bottom tail has been drawn only halfway across the beam. We'll see more examples of this later in the lesson, so don't worry about that for now. Moving on, do you see how beat 3 could be rewritten using another subdivision? Well, this single 16th note triplet actually falls on the and of beat 3, so we could write this instead. The eighth note rest fills the first half of beat 3, which means that the eighth note then falls on the and, filling the second half of the beat. Using a rest has given us a way of placing a note on the and without there having to be any notes in the first half of the beat. If you think about it, there would be no other way of writing this without the use of a rest. This is how powerful and useful rests can be. Some combination of rhythms just can't be written unless you use rests. Pretty cool, huh? Or maybe not, depending on how interesting you find this stuff. Me, I'm a total drum notation geek. I love it. Going back to our example then, we don't need to rewrite beat 4. There's only one other way to rewrite it anyway, as 2 groups of 3 16th note triplets like this. But again, these 2 groups of triplets are within beat 4, so let's group them together with their tails and help to make that clearer to the reader. Now we can see they belong to the same beat. So we've gone from this squiggly mess to this slightly less squiggly mess. It would still be a tough bar to read and count, but at least it's easier on the eye. And that's it for now. Rests simply fill up spaces within a bar. We count them but don't play them, and each subdivision, including triplets, has its own equivalent rest. So before I give you a load of music examples involving rests, let me first introduce you to the final bit of new notation in this video, the dotted note and the dotted rest. Any note or any rest can be written with a dot after it like this. Dots are used to increase the note or rest's duration by half. In other words, the dot makes them 50% longer. So because a quarter note is equal to 2 eighth notes, a dotted quarter note is equal to 3 eighth notes. Likewise, an eighth note is equal to 2 16th notes, so a dotted 16th note is equal in duration to 3 16th notes. And it's the same for the rests as well. So a dotted quarter note rest is equal to 3 eighth notes rests, and a dotted eighth note rest is equal to 3 16th note rests. Now, for reasons that will hopefully become more apparent over time, dots are commonly written after quarter notes and eighth notes only. In theory, any note or rest could be dotted, and we see that in music, but you just don't see it very often. I think of dots as being exclusively used to turn the duration of quarter notes and rests into 3 eighth notes, and eighth notes and rests into 3 16th notes. So let's now dive straight into some musical examples of this, because I find the best way to learn music notation is to see it being used in action. Make sure to watch all of these examples in full, as I give loads of tips and advice throughout each of the examples. Here we go. As I've already mentioned, I like to use as little ink as possible when writing out drum notation. And if possible, group notes into individual beats of the bar using their tails as well. This helps to make music notation easier to read and count and to help the reader to see where the individual beats of the bar fall. So firstly, let's take a look at how we can notate just single notes within each beat of the bar, falling on each of the 4 16th note positions, 1 E-ander, 2 E-ander, etc. So I'm going to show you how to play one note falling on beat 1, one note falling just on the E, one note falling just on the and, one note falling just on the Remember that I'm trying to use as little ink as possible, and I also want each beat of the bar to be as obvious to the reader as possible. So to write a single note falling on the downbeat and nothing else, as we see here for beat 1, we use, obviously, a quarter note. For the second beat of the bar, however, we want to play on the E and nothing else. So we use a 16th note rest to skip over the downbeat of beat 2, which means that this note then falls on the E. There'd be no other way of placing a note on the E of something unless there was a note falling on the beat 2, on the downbeat of beat 2. So the rest has helped us to put just one note onto the E. Now we don't want to play any more notes in beat 2, so this note needs to take up the duration of 3 16th notes, the E and the and the A normal 8th note would just take up 2 16th notes, the E and the and. So I've given this 8th note a dot. This has increased its duration to 3 16th notes, meaning that the whole of beat 2 has now been filled and no other rests are now needed. We could have written beat 2 like this. But this would have required using a 16th note rest to fill up the Instead, I made the 8th note dotted, thus increasing the 8th note's duration and so removing the need for a rest. With me so far? Don't worry if you're not, I have many more examples to come that will hopefully make all this a lot clearer for you, so bear with me and stick with it. Moving on to beat 3 then, we can see that this 8th note rest takes up the first half of the beat, the 1 and the E, which means that this 8th note then falls on the and, filling the duration of the as well. Now beat 4 uses a dotted 8th note rest to push the last note onto the The rest falls on the downbeat of beat 4, and because it's dotted, it has the duration of the first 3 16th notes, 1 E and. We use a 16th note for the final note because we don't want its duration to roll over into the next beat of the bar, into beat 1 of the next bar in this case. The 16th note only fills the and doesn't roll over into the next bar. We could have rewritten beat 4 like this, using an 8th note rest and a 16th note rest to replace the duration of the dotted 8th note rest, but this uses extra ink, and we don't like that, do we? So each beat of the bar has its own set of notes and rests and is self-contained. So let's now hear how this bar would be played and counted out loud. 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 E and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 E and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 E and 3 E and 4 E and 1 and 2 E and 3 E and 4 E and 1. Notice how I changed the counting there, but we'll go on to how we count notes or how I like to count specific rhythms later on in this lesson. Next, let's take a look at how we would write 2 notes falling on each of the 4 16th note positions. So 1 E, E and a 1, etc, etc. Here we go. So here's our next example. We want the first 2 notes of beat 1 to fall on the 1 and the E. So we write it like this. The first note is a 16th, which means that the second note falls on the E as desired. I've made this a dotted 8th note so that it takes up the duration of the E as well as the and the thus removing the need for a rest at the end of the bar. Another common way to write this same rhythm would be like this. 2 16th notes and an 8th note rest to fill up the second half of the beat. It's even a little friendlier to read if you're not used to dotted notes, but we want to use as little ink as possible, so let's go back to the first version. Notice how these 2 notes have been bridged together by their tails. Here's the 16th note with its 2 tails, and here's the 8th note with its single tail. The 16th notes can't be joined to the 8th note with both of their tails because this would then turn the 8th note into a 16th note like this. Instead, the second 16th note tail is drawn only halfway across the beam like this. We want the notes in beat 2 to fall on the E and the and, so a 16th note rest has been used to fill just the downbeat of beat 2. This means that this 16th note can then fall on the E and this 8th note on the and. The 8th note takes up the duration of the of beat 2 as well, so we do not need to use any more rests. Again, notice how only one of the 2 16th notes tails have been bridged over to the 8th note, keeping the 8th note as an 8th note and the 16th notes as 16th notes. Otherwise it would look like this. and we would have to use a 16th note rest to fill up the like this. Beat 3 is relatively simple to read and write. The 8th note rest fills the downbeat of 3 and the E, which means that these two 16th notes then fall on the and the Now beat 4 is very interesting. We want the notes to fall on the downbeat of beat 4 and the only, the first and the fourth note of the beat. So this is the way to write it using as little ink as possible. The dotted 8th note takes up the duration of the first 3 16th notes, allowing this 16th note to then fall on the The two notes have been joined by only a single tail so that the first note remains an 8th note. Like a lot of notation, we can rewrite this rhythm another way, surprise, surprise. But why would we want to use a rest when we can simply increase the 8th note's duration using a dot instead? We have the dot at our disposal, so let's use it in our notation. All of the notes within each beat of the bar have been joined using their tails where possible, and we've used as little ink as possible. Mission accomplished. So let's now hear how this bar will be played and counted. Here we go. 4 and 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and 4 E and 1 E and 2 E and 3 and 4 E and 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and 4 E and 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and 4 E and This next example is going to show us how best to write 3 notes per beat. So 1 E and 1, 1 E all those 4 combinations. Hopefully you already recognise the rhythms in beat 1 and 3 from the first video lesson I did. Using combinations of 2 16th notes and an 8th note, we have notes that fall on the 1 E and the 1 and the E is skipped, without the need for using rests like this. A 16th note rest has been written on the downbeat of beat 2, which means that these 3 16th notes can then fall on the E and of beat 2. Beat 4 is one of those rhythms that at first looks really weird, so let me try and unweird it for you. First of all, we can rewrite this rhythm like this. You'll probably agree that this rhythm is now a little clearer to read. We're playing on the downbeat of 4, on the E, skipping the and then playing on the But in order to use less ink, we can remove this rest by replacing the second 16th note here with an 8th note instead, like this. What freaks people out about the look of this rhythm are the halved beam tails across the top. Hopefully why they've been joined by their tails like this is now starting to make a bit more sense to you. By beaming them this way, this remains a 16th note. Crucially, this is still an 8th note, taking up both the E and the and of the beat, and so this remains a 16th note falling on the There's no reason why you couldn't write this rhythm like this, but we want to use all the notation tools available to us and enforce my self-imposed rule of less ink is better. Let's now hear what this bar sounds like played and counted. Here we go. 1, 2 and 3 and 4 E and 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and 4 E and 1 E and 2 E and 3 E and 4 E and 1 E and 2 E and 3 and 4 E and 1 E and 2 E and 3 and 4 E and 1. Before we move on to our next example, let me quickly summarise for you all of the common ways used to notate the 4 16th note positions, so the past 3 examples that I've shown you. You might want to press pause and become familiar with these very commonly written rhythms. You see them all over the place in written music. I write my rhythms like this all the time, and so do a lot of musicians. Okay, so let's now look at some examples that use other subdivisions as well. Falling on the downbeat of beat 1 is a dotted quarter note. This means that it takes up the same duration as 3 8th notes, which means that these 2 16th notes fall on the and the of beat 2. The downbeat of beat 1, the and the downbeat of beat 2 have all been taken up by the dotted quarter note. Remember that a dotted quarter note is equal to a beat and a half in 4/4 common time, or 3 8th notes. We could use an undotted quarter note and an 8th note rest to write the same rhythm like this, but we have the dotted note in our arsenal, so let's use it. By the way, this is the only time you'll ever see me write a note that rolls over into the next beat of the bar, a note that has a duration that lasts longer than the beat. The dotted quarter note is really useful for representing a beat and a half, so I tend to use it quite a bit. We've covered beat 2, so moving on to beat 3, we have 4 30-second notes taking up the first half of the beat, and 2 16th notes taking up the and the Remember that 4 30-second notes have the same duration as 2 16th notes. Also notice that the two 16th notes in beat 2 have not been joined by their tails to the 4 32nd notes. This is to help the reader clearly see where beat 2 ends and where beat 3 begins. Again, it just makes it easier to read, and that's got to be a good thing, right? And finally, beat 4 has been filled with 8th note triplets. The first note has been rested, so a triplet bracket is used to clearly show the rest is included within the triplets. So if all 3 notes were played and they were joined by their tails, we wouldn't have to use a bracket, but because the first note is a rest and it can't be joined by a tail, we have to use the bracket to clearly indicate to the reader that that rest is included within the triplets. Before I play you this example, I want to quickly talk to you about how I like to generally count bars of music. As a default, I always count 8th notes. So if nothing else is being played, then I will count 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. I only start counting the 16th notes on the E and the of the beats if notes are actually being played on them. So in this example, you can see that the first beat and a half is just counted 8 notes. Then we count the because a note is played on it. All of the 16th notes are counted in beat 3 because they're all played. And for beat 4, I change my counting to triplets. Another little side point I want to show you or talk to you about, when I was learning how to read and count, I would practice counting out loud as much as possible. Of course, once you have internalized the rhythms, you can count it in your head instead. But be honest with yourself. If you're not clearly counting it in your head, then go back to practicing counting it out loud. Learning to count these rhythms is half the battle when learning how to read music. Think about it. If you can't count them, then you're not going to be able to read them off the page. Also, a little bit of advice is that don't always count the rhythms out loud. Like I said, once you've got them internalized, you can count them inside your head. I've had pupils in the past that can only ever read music unless they're counting out loud. And of course, that's no good if you're playing a song with your band. You don't want to be counting out loud as you're playing. So you do want to practice reading, counting in your head. But like I said, be honest with yourself. If you can't do it, then start counting out loud again, at least until you have the rhythms internalized. So, going back to our example, let's now hear what this sounds like when played out loud. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and a 3 E and a 4 triplet. 1 and 2 and a 3 E and a 4 triplet. 1 and 2 and a 3 E and a 4 triplet. 1 and 2 and a 3 E and a 4 triplet. 1. In this example, the notes that fall in beat 1 fall on the downbeat of beat 1, the E, the and is skipped, and the So 1 E and the and is skipped over. The 8th note on beat 2 takes up the first half of the beat, with a set of 16th note triplets filling the second half. Just for some variation, I've written in the triplet bracket above the notes, even though I didn't have to. Beat 3 is played 1 E and the is skipped. The first half of beat 4 is filled with 16th note triplets, while the second half contains 2 16th notes. The beat is counted forte to and. So here's the whole bar played out loud then. Here we go. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 E and a 2 and a 3 E and a forte to and a 1 E and a 2 and a 3 E and a forte to and a 1 E and a 2 and a 3 E and a forte to and a 1 E and a 2 and a 3 E and a forte to and a 1. Beat 1 contains a combination of 32nd notes and 16th notes that you'll very rarely come across at faster tempos, but that work really well when played at slower tempos. The first two 32nd notes take up the downbeat of beat 1, which means that this 16th note then falls on the E. The and is filled with 2 more 32nd notes, whilst the is rested with a single 16th note rest. Both beats 2 and 3 have been filled with a half note. Another way you might see this written is with a quarter note and a quarter note rest like this, but we want to use less ink, so let's stick with the half note for now. For beat 4 we have a set of 8th note triplets and the third triplet note is rested. Here's what this bar sounds like. Quite a tricky one to count. Here we go. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 E and a 1 E and a 2 and 3 and 4 triplet. 1 E and a 2 and 3 and 4 triplet. 1 E and a 2 and 3 and 4 triplet. 1 E and a 2 and 3 and 4 triplets. Ugh. Nasty, but there we go. So let's now start to orchestrate our rhythms around the drums. This obviously makes reading a little trickier, as we now not only have to count the rhythms, but also read where each note falls on the drum kit. High tom, crash cymbal, hi-hat, bass drum, etc, etc. But don't worry though, you won't be alone in finding these hard to read. I've always found reading rhythms spread over the toms tricky to read, still to this day. That being said though, I don't really need to be able to sight read quickly because I'm not a studio drummer, I'm just a guy who likes to drum. If I wanted to learn a piece of music, then I can play it slowly and repeat it until memorised. I don't have to read it straight off the page like that. That's the power written music gives you, being able to learn at your own pace and in your own time. Okay, so here's our first orchestrated example. Hopefully you remember from our first lesson that notes written here are played on the bass drum, here for the high tom, here for the medium tom, and here for the floor tom. And this is what the whole bar sounds like played and counted out loud. Here we go then. 1, 2, and 3, and 4 E, and a 1 E, and a 2 E, and a 3 and a 4 E, and a 1, a 2 E, and a 3 and a 4 E, and a 1, a 2 E, and a 3 and a 4 E, and a 1, a 2 E, and a 3 and a 4 E, and a 1. Take a look at this next example. Playing a bar like this with mixed subdivisions and various drums being played can be quite hard to read. My advice is to play all the notes on just one drum to start off with, so that you at least get used to reading the rhythm first. So if I were to play this bar on just the snare drum, it would sound like this. 1, 2, and 3 E, and a 4 E, and a 1 E, and a 2 E, and a 3 E, and a 4 and a 1 E, and a 2, and a 3 E, and a 4 and a 1 E, and a 2, and a 3 E, and a 4 and a. Now that we can read and count the rhythm, we can now look at the orchestration. Crash cymbals are written above the top line like this, as we know from our first lesson. So we're playing the snare drum and crash and bass drum here, the high tom and crash and bass drum here, the medium tom and then crash and bass drum here, and the floor tom and then the crash and bass drum here. Notice that we're moving around the drums from snare drum to floor tom. Noticing patterns like this helps us to play the bar easier. Beat 4 has been filled with 16th note triplets, and just for fun, I've grouped them into 2 groups of 3, for no reason. So let's now hear what the bar sounds like when played and counted out loud. 1, and 2, and 3, and 4 E, and a 1 E, and a 2 E, and a 3 E, and a 4 and a 1 E, and a 2 E, and a 3 E, and a 4 and a 1 E, and a 2 E, and a 3 E, and a 4 and a 1 E, and a 2, and a 3 E, and a 4 and a. By the way, this is my high tom, this is my medium tom, this is my floor tom. You could also make that the high tom, that the medium tom, that the floor tom. Up to you, depending on how many drums you have, but just to make things simple, high tom, medium tom, floor tom in this lesson. This is a really cool rhythm that uses 2 new pieces of notation we haven't seen yet. The first thing to point out is that the notes that fall on this line are played with the auxiliary pedal of a double bass drum pedal. So as we already know, the first bass drum note written here is played with your leading foot. In my case, I'm left-footed with my bass drum. You're most likely to be right-footed if you're right-handed. And the second note written here is supposed to be played with the other foot or the other pedal on your double bass drum pedal. If you've got 2 bass drums, then obviously you're playing the other bass drum. If you don't have a double bass drum pedal, then you would obviously try to play both notes with just the one pedal if you came across a piece of music like this. So going back to beat 1, we can see that the first 3 notes are 16ths, and the of beat 1 contains 2 32nd notes played on the double bass drum. It's the same for the E and the of beat 2. The other piece of notation I want to show you are these little notes here. These are used to represent flams, played either right-handed, a right-handed flam, or left-handed, a left-handed flam. The little notes are called grace notes and indicate the light strokes played just before the main note. So in the right-handed flam, the left hand plays the grace note. Left hand's coming down nice and low. And the right hand is the main note, or main stroke. Also, do you see that the last 16th note of beat 1 has been joined to the 32nd notes with 2 tails, instead of just the 1 as we've seen in previous examples? This is all fine and dandy, because both notes still retain their value. The 16th note still has 2 tails, and the 32nd note still has 3. We could join the notes with a single tail instead like this, or have them not joined at all like this. It really doesn't matter, and has no effect on the way the notes are counted or played. It's just another choice open to us when joining notes by their tails. Okay, so let's hear what this bad boy sounds like then. You ready for this? Okay, here we go. 1, 2, 3, and 4 E and a 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 ta-ta and a 4 triplet 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 ta-ta and a 4 triplet 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 ta-ta and a 4 triplet 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 ta-ta and a 4 triplet. Oof. In the last part of this video, I want to focus purely on notating drum beats. So let's take a look at our first example now. The first thing to notice in this bar are the 2 new pieces of notation. The O represents an open hi-hat, and the little plus sign, represents a closed hi-hat. So in this drum beat, the hi-hat is open on the and of beat 1, as indicated by the little O, and closed again on the downbeat of beat 2, as indicated by the little plus sign. Some drummers like to write a note where the hi-hat closes like this. This X note head written in this position on the stave represents the hi-hat played with the foot. But its inclusion isn't necessary if there's already another note written in the same place where the hi-hat closes. So if we took away the hi-hat and snare drum notes on beat 2 like this, then we would need to write in the hi-hat foot note in order to perch our little plus above it. Also notice that I have included a suggested sticking for the 2 snare drum notes at the end of the bar. The R represents the right hand and the L the left. Vice versa if you're left-handed. Whenever you see a suggested sticking like this, use whichever hand you naturally lead with. So if you're left-handed, then the R is going to represent left for you. Whenever I'm checking out a drum beat on paper for the first time, one of the first things I look at is what the leading hand is doing. In this example, you can see that the leading hand is going to play continuous 8th notes on the hi-hat right up to beat 4 of the bar. Next, you want to find out where the snare drum backbeats fall. In this case, they fall on beats 2 and 4. Then I finally check out the bass drum in order to get a good idea of what the rhythm being played is. I'm now going to show you another way we could write this bar to help make this clearer. As we know from our first lesson, notes joined vertically by the stem are played at the same time as each other. So any 2 notes joined by the same stem fall down at the same time on the drum kit. But we could rewrite the bar like this. The bass drum now has been given its own set of notes and rests at the bottom of the bar. So we now have 2 lines of notes, one for the hands and one for the feet. You can see that a good writer of music, like myself of course, will still try to line up the notes vertically with each other, even though they're not joined by the same note stem anymore. So even though they're not joined by the same vertical stem, I still try to get them underneath where they fall with each other, so I don't want to make the reading too difficult for people. Although in theory you wouldn't have to, which is why I mentioned it, because if you're reading the notes and rests for their values and durations, then you wouldn't have to worry about do they line up with each other on the paper. The notes and rests tell you that. Writing 2 sets of notes like this allows the reader to very quickly read the rhythm being played on the bass drum separately to the hands, and vice versa. So for the bass drum, we have a quarter note falling on beat 1. The dotted 8th note rest takes up the first 3 16th notes of beat 2, which means that this 16th note falls on the It hasn't been joined to the 8th note on beat 3 by its tail because it belongs in a separate beat of the bar. These 2 8th notes fill beat 3 and then beat 4 is rested with a quarter note rest. So if we read the bass drum line only, then we get this rhythm. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 E and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 E and 3 and 4 and. Whilst the hands are playing this. Here we go. 1, 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and So now let's write the 2 lines together again and hear what this groove sounds like when played as a whole. Here we go. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and a 3 and 4 and a 1 and 2 and a 3 and 4 and a 1 and 2 and a 3 and 4 and a 1 and 2 and a 3 and 4 and a... For this next example, let's stick with writing the hands and feet separately. It's very common for the bass drum to be written on its own like this when playing a repeating pattern, especially if the hands are doing something more complicated over the top. Playing quarter notes on the bass drum like this is commonly referred to as playing 4 on the floor, hopefully for obvious reasons. Notice that no hi-hats are written above each of these snare drum notes. This suggests to the reader that the hi-hat pattern is to be played as a double-handed, hand-to-hand hi-hat pattern, because obviously when you come off the hi-hat, the snare, to play the snare drum, the hi-hat is going to be played at the same time. Most of the time, though, a writer will make this obvious by writing the suggested sticking underneath like this. This makes it nice and clear. So let's now hear what this drum beat sounds like to be played up to speed out loud. Double-handed, here we go. 1 and 2 and 3 E and a 4 E and a 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a 1. Take a look at this drum beat. First thing you might notice are these angle brackets above the notes written here, and these round brackets around the note heads here. The angle brackets are called accents and represent notes that are to be played loudly. Yes, more loudly than usual. Usually on the snare drum and usually as rim shots. Accents can be written over any note and played on any part of the drum kit, including cymbals. The round brackets are used to represent what are commonly called ghost notes. These notes are played as quietly as possible. They're ghostly. Ooh, ghost notes. Just like accents, ghost notes can also be written around anywhere, any note, and on any part of the drum kit. So these accented notes are going to be played as rim shots on the snare drum like this. I'm hitting the edge and the centre of the drum at the same time. And the ghost notes are going to be played quietly with little tap strokes on the snare drum like this. So I'm only coming up a little bit, not very high at all. Just for fun, let's separate the two lines and take a closer look at what's actually being played. You can see that we're only playing the bass drum on 1 and 3 and that we're actually playing quarter notes on the ride cymbal. I can make that even clearer for you by separating the rides from the other notes like this. These 4 quarter notes are played on the ride cymbal on beats 1, 2, 3 and 4. And you can see that the bass drum and snare drum are actually playing this rhythm. Here we go. Let's try and play just the bass drum and snare drum part. 1 and 2 and 3 E and a 4 E and a 1 and 2 E and a 3 E and 4 E and a 1 and 2 E and a 3 E and 4 E and a 1. But let's go back to the original example, as this is how I like to write my drum beats most of the time, with all the notes joined together by the stems. By the way, any sufficient reader should be able to read any of the previous variations with equal ease. So if you find that one is easier to read than the other, then this is probably because you're still not familiar enough with the way notes can be grouped by their tails and stems. Don't worry though, this is exactly how it started for me as well. So this whole drum beat example would sound like this. Here we go. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 E and a 3 E and 4 E and a 1 and 2 E and a 3 E and 4 E and a 1 and 2 E and a 3 E and 4 E and a 1 and 2 E and a 3 E and 4 E and a 1. For our next example, let's take a look at a drum beat written exclusively in triplets. Notice that we're playing the first and third note of each group of triplets on the hi-hat. As I mentioned earlier, drummers commonly call this rhythm the shuffle, and it sounds like this. Playing the first and third note of each triplet. 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet, 1 and 2 and da 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 da. That's the rhythm called the shuffle. I've written an open hi-hat represented by the little O above the last note of beat 4, which then closes on beat 1 when the bar is repeated. Hence why I've written the plus above the downbeat of beat 1. When you first play the bar, the little plus thing tells you nothing. But when you get to the end of the bar and then repeat it, you need to know where to close the hi-hat after it's been opened. That's why it's been included. Now, I want to hopefully blow your mind just one more time by rewriting this bar as a bar of 12/8. That's a time signature 12/8, meaning that there are now 12 eighth notes in the bar. You might notice something familiar. Yep, it's exactly the same as the bar of 4/4, and in fact, will also be played exactly the same as well. The only thing that changed was the time signature, and so as a consequence, the way the eighth notes in the bar were counted. This is because a bar of 4/4 can hold up to 12 eighth note triplets, the same number of eighth notes as a bar of 12/8 can hold. Because of this, some music that's played in 4/4 common time triplets, especially slow tempo ballads, tend to be written using the time signature 12/8. I think of this magical time signature as the triplet-based time signature, as it allows the writer to work in groups of 3 without having to constantly write triplet brackets. So it doesn't matter whether this drum beat is written in 12/8 or in 4/4 using eighth note triplets. Both bars sound and are played exactly the same. The only thing that's different is the way it's written and counted. Speaking of which, let's have a listen. But before we do, I want to quickly show you some other things that you'll commonly see written in bars of 12/8. Because a bar of 12/8 can be thought of as 4 groups of 3 eighth notes, the dotted quarter note and the dotted quarter note rests are commonly used to represent each of those groupings. Remember that a dotted quarter note or dotted quarter note rest is equal to 3 eighth notes in duration. So you tend to see a lot of dotted quarter notes and rests in the time signature of 12/8 and even in 6/8, which is just half a bar of 12/8 if you think about it, just like a bar of 2/4 is half the length of a bar of 4/4. Moving now on to the subject of counting shortcuts, here's an example of a shuffle rhythm being played on the hi-hats. Counting all 3 triplet notes, 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet, 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet, can become a real mouthful, especially at faster tempos. So drummers tend to count shuffle triplets, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. You can hear that I gave the counting a little lilt. D, 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 not d, 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 but d, 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 d. I'm only counting the first and third triplet note of each beat, as I mentioned earlier, and skipping over the middle notes. 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. The counting is said to have been swung or shuffled. For beats of the bar where the middle triplet is played though, such as here in beat 3, I like to count the triplets in full. So this whole bar would be counted like this. So just the counting, 1 and 2 and 3 triplet, 4 triplet, 1 and 2 and 3 triplet, 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 triplet, 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 triplet, 4 and. Let's now hear what the whole drum beat sounds like when played all over the kit using this new counting system. 1, 2 and 3 triplet, 4 and 1 and 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 2 and 3 triplet, 4 and 1. For the final example in this lesson, I want to stay in triplets and look at the rhythm commonly known as the jazz ride cymbal pattern. This is the ride cymbal pattern that a lot of drummers play in jazz music. Of course, drummers also tend to improvise a lot within this style of music, but this is the standard pattern that you'll find in all Jazz Drumming 101 standard exercise books. In jazz, the hi-hat foot also tends to be stepped on beats 2 and 4 of the bar, as shown here. So using the new swung eighth note counting system, the whole bar would sound like this. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. Let's now add in some snare and bass drum notes to make it a bit more interesting to play and finally hear what that sounds like. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 triplet, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 triplet, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 triplet 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 triplet 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 triplet 1. And just for fun, play it up a little bit faster. Sort of sounds like this. Jazz. Alrighty, so there's the end of the lesson for you. I hope you found it useful. Like most things in life, reading and writing drum notation becomes easier the more you practice it, obviously. For me, learning to read music was a step-by-step process that I got better at over time. I found the whole subject of reading music a little overwhelming at first, but the potential really excited me. I could imagine writing out my own drum parts so I would never forget them again, or being able to read and understand the thousands of available drum education books and DVDs, or even being able to transcribe note for note and then teach myself my favourite songs, drum beats, fills, solos, etc. The potential is enormous, and being able to read and write drum music has been the most useful skill I ever learnt for the drums. So I hope you find your own motivation for learning drum notation, as I did, and remember, learning to read and write music becomes easier with practice, so don't give up, and I promise you won't regret it. In fact, you'll look back and wonder how on earth you ever survived without being able to read and write music in the first place. Promise you of that. Thanks for watching this lesson, and please do check out the hundreds of other products I have available on my website at www.drumstheword.com. Until our next drum lesson together, happy drumming to you.